Hi, I'm Jasiek and I'll be talking about CDC, which is Consumer-Driven Contracts. So what the hell is that? If you're working on a web application that has back and front separation, you usually have the same set of questions that appear over and over again while you're implementing new features. For example, what endpoints can I use? What input do the endpoints take? Or what does the output look like? Those three questions appear because you need to be communicative about how the features will work, like how the system will communicate between the two layers, backend and frontend. And basically, those three questions would be answered by single contract in consumer-driven contract setting. So before we get to how this works, let's see the few terms that are really important, and we'll be using them all the time in this presentation. First one is provider, second consumer, third one is interaction, and the fourth one, the most important one, would be contract. So consumer and provider, what do you mean, dude? So let's get simple here. A consumer would be a client, for example, a front-end layer of the application, and the provider is a service, so basically a backend. What are interactions? Interactions are, well, nothing else than HTTP requests. For example, that we have a client that is a consumer, let's say a front-end application, asks the backend service, which is post service, which is a provider, asks for a list of posts. So this is one interaction that has a response. So now that we know what an interaction is, what are contracts? A contract is a set of interactions. It's a collection of those interactions between a given consumer and a provider. So what exactly are interactions? Let's get down to the business now. So an interaction is nothing else but a HTTP request, and it basically defines what kind of request do we have, like what is this request for, what is its purpose. It has a state of the provider, which is required for the interaction to pass. And it also, of course, has some definitions like headers, status, all of that stuff. What is really important here is that actually in CDC, when you have an interaction, you can specify the state of the provider and it has to be fulfilled in order for this interaction to happen. What does that even mean? It means that you can specify all the paths you want to go through. So not only success path can be tested upon, but also the failed path. And these can be multiple scenarios. Even if you consider the example from PAC, you can see that you have three requests, which are basically the same interaction. It's just a request for an alligator, but the states are very different. So you can see in the first one you have a request for an alligator, given there is an alligator named Mary. So here we say that the provider has to be in a state where its data store contains an alligator named Mary, and it will be returned. Another request would be given there is not an alligator named Mary. So basically we say, all right, I want this request to fail because it's gonna be 404, for example. And the third one is another state for the same base interaction. Consumer test contains interactions which define a contract. And here you can see a real life example, a Go code that defines an interaction. And you can also see the state is provided. So we say that given vehicles in state active are available. And it defines the request that will be sent. So it will be a get request for this given path. It also has some query arguments and some headers. And we say that we expect a response with a status of 200 and some kind of body. So those sets of interactions eventually create a contract file. A contract file is nothing else but just a JSON file that can be stored in, for example, a repository. It contains all of the interactions that the contract has. However, it's kind of a troublesome thing. Like if you were to always store your contract files in the repositories, it would be really pain in the ass to share them between the projects. So if you have, for example, a microservice architecture at your company or at your product, it would be annoying to always upload those contract files or share them between the repositories so the other, so the consumer can use them and then the provider can use them as well and test against them, all of that stuff. So it would be really annoying, and for this particular reason, a PAC Broker has happened. So a PAC Broker is basically a web service developed by PAC, and it allows you to upload all the contract files to a single centralized instance and basically use this instance as the sharing point between all the services you have. So in this particular example, you can see that there is a consumer foo, and you can see that it has a lot of providers. So foo has an animals provider, a bar provider, Hello World app, and Wiffles. So as you can see, these are 4 different contracts, and probably all of those applications, including foo, animals, bar, Hello World app, and Wiffles, use those contracts to test against them. So foo has to have access to all those 4 contracts, and animals has to have the access to foo, bar has to have access to this contract, Hello World app, and Wiffles. And thanks to PAC Broker, it's really easy. It's just automated. You can also see that it allows you to register when was the last time those providers have verified the contracts against them, and also when was the pact published. PAC Broker has another great feature, and it's the connection graph. You can see that particular services have specific interactions with each one of them. And if you click at one of those links, let me get back to it, sorry. Yeah, if you click on one of those links you've seen just a moment ago, you would see this. So you would see the zoo app and animal service and all of the interactions you have between them. So thanks to that, and thanks to the PAC Broker, you can actually set it all up in a way that your provider testing happens in a single test. This single test, as you can see in the screenshot, basically has a test provider function, and it defines that you want to test against this consumer. I'm sorry. You have to test against this provider. So you're defining that your application, the current application this test is in, is a consumer with given name, and it also acts as a provider with a specific name. And after that, you specify that you want to verify provider. You provide the base URL, which is used as the state creator. I'll get to that in a moment. You also specify the broker URL, which is PAC Broker URL, the username, password, obviously, and all of the stuff that you need to configure. So your test will be able to download all the contract files for this specific provider and use those contracts as kind of, let's say, integration tests. So about this provider base URL. So I mentioned before that when you have an interaction, you can also specify the state for the provider. And it works in a way that when the provider, in this specific example, when the provider downloads a contract from the PAC Broker, before it fires the interaction it wants to fire, it looks up the state and informs the provider by hitting the provider base URL, and it says, hey, I want to fire some kind of interaction. It requires you to be in a specific state. Please be in this state. And at this particular moment, the provider knows that it has to set itself up to a state, and it will be ready for the interaction. So basically you can make it so a state says that you have to populate your database with thousands of records, and basically the provider base URL will be informed about it. So your provider will get to know the state it has to be in before the interaction is fired. And obviously you can nicely hook it all up in a CI in a way that it's like your code will be only deployed if the CDC tests pass, if it all works great, if you don't break work of other people, other projects. So the development process. Why CDC? Why should you use it? So the general idea is that it helps providers make changes without being scared of accidentally breaking their consumers. So what does that even mean? It means that if you have separate teams for frontend and backend, it allows your backend developers to work on their part, on their side of the code, without being scared of breaking frontend's work or breaking their flow. Obviously, it happens if you have a proper CI management, if you actually have the CDC in place in the pipeline somewhere. And how is that it happens? Is that if you manage to bring changes that would fail the contract, you are basically not allowed to deploy. And thanks to that, you have to fix your code first or make changes to the contract, but that has to happen with consumers' commitment. So you have to communicate. CDC forces you to communicate if you really need to break some things. It also lets consumers know that the APIs they consume won't suddenly break. It's kind of it's a contract. You basically shake hands and say, all right, this contract will be fulfilled. It's an agreement. You cannot break it. It allows consumers to develop against API definitions before the provider API has actually been developed. And it's thanks to that, what you should do is that you should create the contract first. You have to first agree on what will be delivered, and then you should work on the code. And thanks to that, front-end developers can use, like the consumers, can use those contract files to feed the stub service, to feed the mock service. You basically tell the PAC that, okay, this is the contract file. I would like to be able to hit the service, blah, 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 and get the response, and then use the response in my own code. And what PAC does is that it takes the contract file and acts like the mock service, which is really awesome. It makes integrating and testing as a service in a microservice landscape easier, and serves as an efficient communication tool between provider and consumer teams. And that's because, well, the last point is really great. As I said, like it forces both sides to communicate. You have to communicate in order to make changes, and also it makes integrating things a lot easier, because you have a clear definition of all the interactions between different services, different consumers and providers, and you can actually grasp all the communication graphs in an easy manner. And I think the greatest quote about how CDC is awesome is from Alex Pross. Contract testing lets everyone relax and be assured that the APIs won't break up and die. It happened a lot of times in the work I've done, and it's been a pain always if an integration dies. And CDC makes sure that everything you have in place will be always ready to go, unless someone breaks it, but then you will know beforehand. Thank you.